It seems like everything has an API these days, but have you ever wondered how to make use of an API in your application? It turns out that it isn't really that hard. In this video, I'm going to show you how to easily load the data from two different APIs into our application. Along the way, I'll show you how to avoid some memory issues and some other best practices around talking to APIs. Now, if you're new to this channel, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. This channel is full of videos explaining the various parts of C#. I also have a website where I provide full courses in C# and SQL. You can check it out at IamTimCorey.com. That is also where a blog post for this video is located. It includes the source code for my sample application, both at the start of the video as well as the end. Also note that in the description below, you can find links to join my mailing list or to support me on Patreon. Okay, let's get started in our example project. For this application, I set up a simple WPF user interface that has two forms. This main form will be where we load up the images from the XKCD comic. The other is called Sun Info, and we're going to display the sunrise and sunset times of the day in this form. So that's pretty simple. That's all it is. This right here, we have a demo library, but that's just empty right now because we're starting from scratch. Or almost that. I've got a button in here and a couple of text blocks, and the main window has 3 buttons and an image. So let's talk through what we're going to be doing. We're talking to two different APIs, like I said, and the first one is for the XKCD comic. Now, it's a kind of a nerdy comic, so if you go to XKCD, you'll see the current comic as well as previous ones and random ones. Well, they have an API. It's a really simple API. Either you call this URL for the current comic, or you call this URL with this number 614 being the number of the comic you're looking for. So we're going to make use of both of these to load up these comics in and flip through them in our application. The other thing we're going to do is this sunrise and sunset time. So if you know your latitude and longitude, and you can find that out fairly easily on Google, just looking for your address or other information, you can find a close latitude and longitude. It doesn't have to be exact. And you can use this to find when the sun will rise and when the sun will set for your location. It's going to give you all this information. So we're going to load both of these just to kind of demo the different pieces of loading APIs. I want to show two different ones that are just, totally different so that you can kind of get a feel for what's similar and what's different in these. And they also provide a couple of other unique tidbits that'll be fun to do. So let's start with the comic first. I'm going to drag this off a screen. So what we have here is, my plan is when the form loads, we're going to load the comic in this space down here, the image space, which is essentially the rest of the form. And then we're going to allow the user to go previous to previous comics or next if it's not the current one. So obviously if you're in the current comic, you can't go any farther forward in the future, but you can go to previous comics. And once we get to comic number 1, if we ever got that low, then this will be grayed out and we can only go next. So that's the plan for that. Sun Info button, what that's going to do is load up the other form, Sun Info, and then allow us to make a call from there. So the first thing I want to do is actually go to my demo library and create a new class. I'm going to call this class let's call it API Helper. I hit public. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to create some of the basic needs of an API call. Now, before we add anything to this class, I'm going to first go to my references for my library, right-click on References, and say Manage NuGet Packages. I want to bring one in. We search for Web API, if I can spell today, .client. Now it's called Microsoft.ASP.NET.WebAPI.Client, but I found just searching WebAPI.Client finds it just fine. We're going to go ahead and install that. I accept it. And then right away, once it's installed, we don't have to, but I'd like to go to update the Newtonsoft.json. So right now it's at version 6.0.4 with that package of the Web API client. We can upgrade it to version 11.0.2 as of the recording of this video. We can go ahead and do that. Again, I like to update all of my NuGet packages to the latest version if I can at the very start of the application. It just makes my work later smaller. So get all the updates out of the way as soon as possible so if you run into any bugs, you find them early. Okay, so now what we're going to do is create a property, and we'll call this, it's an HTTP client, which we have to hit control dot and say using system.net.http. And we'll call it, my tab doesn't work anymore because I did the control dot. We'll call it the web. We don't want to call it web client because that's going to step on some toes. So let's call it the API client. That works. And we'll immediately initialize it as well. And that's something right there that you wouldn't think I was going to do, but I'm going to make it static. Now, usually we don't have properties that are static. Usually we want to instantiate a property so that we don't step on toes, so that everybody can have their own version of that property instead of having the whole application share one. But in this case, we're going to make it static because of the fact that HTTP client, we want to open it once per application. And yes, that's very unusual. It's not something we do every day, but in this specific case, we want to open it once per application. What it does is it opens up a TCP IP port, and some of that setup time setup work takes some extra time. And so we want to do it once. And it is designed to be thread safe. It's designed to have multiple concurrent calls. It's set up to do all these things with one HTTP client for the entire application. So think of it like opening up one browser on your computer. So we can have multiple tabs and all the rest, but we're only using one browser. We don't need to have 5 versions of that browser open. We can just have different tabs. So in this case, we're going to make it static. And then we'll have one static method, a void type, and it will be initialize client. What this will do is it will set up the API client. Yes, we've initialized it with a new HTTP client. And in fact, you know what? Let's move that. Yeah, let's move it down into the actual method call. That way we can check this for null. Since it's a class, we can check for null first. And if it's null, we'll call the initialize client. Let's take the semicolon off there too. API client equals new HTTP client. Then we're going to say client dot, API client dot default header requests dot accept dot clear. And we're going to add one new header request. And this will be a new media type with quality header value. Yeah, it's kind of long. Application/JSON. Okay. So there we go. So what this is, and actually, must hit the dot there. There we go. That shrinks it down. We'll add the using up here. So this is going to add a header that says, give me JSON, essentially. And that way we can parse it then into our models. So we're just saying, give us, for the request, we're saying, just give us JSON. We're not going to look for a web page with the tags and all the rest. We're looking for data with type JSON. All right, and that will be all we need to do for this initialize client. Now we can make this more robust if we want, but this is really a sample application. I'm not going to go full in depth on this. The one thing that I want to point out is typically what we do here as well is say API.Client.base address equals new URI and then the address. And so what this is, if we come back over here to the XKCD comic, notice that both of these start off with HTTP. So we can highlight here. They start off, well, let's highlight this way. They highlight everything but the highlighted part is what they start off with, both of them. So we could use that as a base address and then append info.0.json or 614/info.0.json. So that's what the base address would allow us to do. So we'd come in here and we'd say http xkcd.com, like so. And then all commands after that would just be appending on the end. Now, we're not going to do that today. We're actually going to leave the base address blank. And the reason why is because we're going to use the same HTTP client for more than one base address, because the sunrise and sunset information comes from a totally different website. So we'll leave that blank. So now we have an API client set up that's static, and actually make the whole class static. We have our API client. We can initialize that client. That's the first thing we'll do. And in fact, we'll do that in the main window. That's where our application really starts. So we will say API helper, bring our user statement in, dot initialize client. So now our HTTP client is initialized at the start of our application. We could technically put it in the app.xaml in here, but I'm going to leave it right in the root of our main window because it's more visible there to me. So all this did, all the API helper did for us, and this API client, is it allows us to make calls on the internet now. This is what we'll use, the API client. We'll use this to make calls like you would use a browser to pull up web pages. Well, in this case, it's a browser for our application. So now let's create a class for loading our comic. So let's right-click on Demo Library. We're going to say Add Class, and this is just for loading the comic strip, or the comic itself. So we're going to call this the comic processor. It's going to process comics. Make it public. It will not be static. It will be instantiated. And we're going to need to have a few things in here, but let's start off by building our actual call to the API. So we have a public async, because we want to make web calls asynchronously. And the reason why is because we don't know how long it's going to take to get information back from the website. We don't want to depend on the other website being, ultra performant. Instead, we have to assume that it might take a little bit to get data back. And so we'll make it asynchronous so our application doesn't lock up. and we're going to return a type task, and we'll change this to be a task of something, but for right now we'll just return task because we don't have that something to return yet. So we'll call it task, and we'll say we're going to load comic, and we're going to pass in the comic number because these are all numbered. We'll default that to 0. And so what 0 will be is it will be the current comic. So if you don't pass anything in, or if you pass in a 0, it's going to be the current comic. Otherwise, it's whatever number comic you're looking for specifically. Okay, so let's start off with our URL. And we don't know what the URL is going to be yet because we don't know if the comic is 0 or not. So let's handle that first. If comic number is greater than 0, then what we're going to do is say URL equals $, couple double quotes and a semicolon. Come back in here and say https xkcd.com/ and our comic number, and then /info.0.json. So that's what it's going to be if we're going to use a comic number. However, if we're not going to use a number, we're going to say URL equals, and it's the same base right here. And at the end, it's this info.0.json. Every API will have different terminology or different ways to express their API. So you're going to have to get used to their system for doing things and may modify your code accordingly. But in this case, this is the format, and that's fine. We'll handle it from here. Next, we're going to do is actually open up a call to our web browser, or in this case, the client. So using HTTP response message, let's spell it right, HTTP response message, which is in the using system.net.http. We'll call it response equals await client, it's going to be the API helper dot API client dot get async in our URL. So what that'll do is it will open up a new call or a new request off of our API client, and it's going to wait for this response. Now, what's going to happen is when we actually open up this call and get the response back, at the end of this using statement, it's going to close everything down related to this particular request. That way you don't have to remember to dispose of things and make sure that our calls are all cleaned up. That's one of the things we be careful of is we don't want to leave ports open. We don't want to open up new ports all the time. There's a lot of different things we need to be careful of as far as memory management and network management and port management when we're talking about opening up APIs. So using one client for all of our calls and then making sure that our actual specific calls get disposed of properly, they're both important in making sure that we're managing our resources well. So now in here, and this is already at this point made the call, that's all it was, get async, that URL, wait for the response. So if the response is success status code. So there's a couple different success status codes, but it's essentially saying if it's successful, then you can do something with it. All right, so we're going to do something with it. In this case, we're going to read the data that has come back. But as at this point, you wonder, well, what is the data that's going to come back? And that's where the best thing to do is to actually make a call and look at the data. So I'm going to click on this, and this is the data, which is not pretty at all, but that's okay. Let's see if I can't make that a little bigger for you. So this is JSON. Notice the curly braces. So the first thing here, the month, that's a property, and the 8 is its value. Num is a property. This is a value. So you have to kind of understand how to read it. And like I said, everyone's different. But in this case, num 2030, that's the comic number. So as of the recording of this video, we're on comic 2030. And it's in 2018, month 8. That's August of 2018, day 8. Which that's not today's date, but that's the last date, the most current comic as of today. So we have our num, which we're going to want to grab. We have title and safe title. Sorry, safe title and title. We're going to grab title. We have the image, img, which is this actual image here. And in fact, if we were to copy this and open a new tab, there's our actual comic. So those are the things you want. We don't have to grab everything. So for example, the alt text, we're not going to deal with that in this application. Yes, it's important. And yes, we should probably attach this if we're going to display it, because if a person is visually can't get the pictures and has a screen reader read to them, this alt text is important. So just keep that in mind. But for this application, we're not going to do that. We're just going to grab the number, the title. Actually, we don't even care about the title. I'm not going to display it. So the number that it is and the actual image. That's it. So num and img. So let's create a new model. We're going to call this comic model. I hit public. This is going to be the num property, and this is going to be the img property. So these names correspond to the actual API. So I would have preferred not to see it be called num, but that's okay. It's not the end of the world. Notice though I did change the casing. So this is in standard C# casing of Pascal casing, where every word, the first letter gets a capital letter. So that's one of those things that the JSON converter can do for us, is say, let's not worry about casing as long as the names match up. So now what we can do is we can say comic model, comic equals await response dot content dot read as async, and it's of type comic model. So what's happening here with this read as async, and this is part of what comes in the web API, is it uses that Newtonsoft JSON converter, and it takes the data in as JSON and says, let's try and convert it over to the type that you've given us. And it maps over anything it finds that matches. So in this case, it's going to match the num and the img properties. Now, what it's not going to do is it's not going to worry about all that data that we didn't need. So month, link, year, news, save title, we don't care. And so it says, if you're not going to have that as one of your properties, then I'm assuming you don't care. And that's perfect. I see a lot of people who wire up APIs have these huge, long models that have all the possible data, but they don't care about all that data. So unless you care about it, don't put it in your model. If you think you might care about it down the road, sure, add it if you want. But don't spend the time on stuff you're not going to use. In this case, I'm not using anything but num and image. So that's all I'm going to care about. All right. Now in here, what I'm going to do is, now that I have my comic back, I'm going to return comic. But we're not quite done yet, because first of all, you can't return a comic yet. You have to make it a task of type. Remember I said we're going to come back to this later. Task of type comic model. So now we're going to return a comic model, but not everything returns a value, not all code paths. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to say else, because that's really the problem here, is this if statement. So I'm saying only if it's successful. Well, if it's not successful, that's a problem, right? Well, sure it is. Throw new exception, and we'll say response dot reason phrase. And that's just the reason why it wasn't successful. So essentially, it's going to throw an exception if there's a problem getting our data, which is what we'd expect. Either give us back good data, or it says there's a major problem, blow up. So now we have this load comic method, and it will return a comic model. Now before we go, I want to add one property to this comic processor. And it's going to be called max comic number. What we're going to do is, if you call this with comic number of 0, so if comic number equals 0, then I'm going to say that the max comic number equals comic.num. So if you call it with a 0, it means the current comic. And we find that comic, I'm going to grab the number of that comic and say, well, that's the max one you can go to. And this will help us out in our UI when we're trying to go to previous and next to know what the top of the limit is, or top of the range is. Now, as I'm sitting here looking at this, the only thing I'm concerned about is the idea of cross-threading, because this technically is going to be called on a task, and it's going to be calling something that's not inside a task. Let's change this. Let's take that back out, and we'll move this logic over to our form. So the form will handle it. Since the form is what is doing the previous and next, I feel that's okay. So let's go over to our form now and look at our code behind, which has pretty much nothing. And we have the previous and next, and we're going to load this when we load the form itself. So let's start by creating a private async, if I can spell, async task called load image. And it's going to pull in the image number just like before. And in this one, we're going to say, let's just do var comic equals await. And then we'll say it's comic processor dot, oops, we have to instantiate it. Actually, let's make it static. That way we don't have to instantiate it, because there's no reason to make it static. Comic processor dot load comic. And we'll pass in our image number. So it's going to grab back that comic and put it here. And we're going to do, at this point, the code for if image number equals 0, then let's set up two private variables here. Max number and current number. So max number equals the comic.num. And either way, we're going to set the current number equal to the comic.num. So we're going to load an image. That's what's going to do. That'll take care of calling it, taking care of the numbers. But then down here, let's actually apply that to our image, which is called comic image. So that little bit, we're going to say var URI source equals new URI. And it's the comic.img. And the kind, it's the kind is going to be an absolute path. So what this does, it applies, it grabs this URL and says it's a full URL, not just a partial URL. Partial URL would be just the end of the URL. We already have the beginning, you know, if we're on a website or something like that. But we're not, we want the absolute. So we're going to grab the whole thing, and then we'll set the comic image dot source equal to the, actually it's new bitmap. And bitmap image, and it is URI source. Okay, so that's all we're doing, which is, yeah, it's a little trickier because it's WPF and it's doing images, but once you do it once, it's pretty simple. So we're grabbing that URL, which is called a uniform resource indicator, I believe, URI. We grab that and we say it's an absolute URL, and it puts that into the URI source. And we use that to create a bitmap. So it's going to go out to the URL, it's going to load up the image, and it's going to create a bitmap image out of it and put that into our WPF image here. So that's how it's going to work. We're going to see it in action in a minute, but that's the process. We're calling our API, which that seemed pretty simple. And then we're grabbing a couple pieces of information about the current one that it is, if it's the max one or if it's either way what the current number is. And then we're applying that image to our image, and it should display right away. So to test this out, let's go ahead and call this load image without an image number right away. Now you'd think you could put it right in the constructor, but the problem is you can't make a constructor asynchronous. And we don't want to convert this into a synchronous call and have it block our application if something were to happen to the website. It's very performant, but we don't want to depend on somebody else's performance in order for our application to be performant. So here's a little trick that I've picked up that is, to an extent, it's a little bit hacky, but it's not. So if you go to properties on your window itself, notice my cursor's up here in the window. You go to properties, there is an event in here, but you can also just type it. If you just type loaded. And what this is, it's the event for when the window is loaded. So I create a new event right there called window_loaded. And now right here, I can make this async. And we'll say await load image. That's it. So now if we start this application, which before I do, the one thing I always forget, let's go back up here to my properties. And again, either come over here or type it out. We're going to go to the window, window set location. And set it to center screen. Windows startup location, that's what it is. Sometimes I find it easy to go to the properties and find it. Sometimes I find it easier to go and just type it. It's up to, whatever sticks in your brain, do that. So Windows startup location, center screen. That way it pops up in this screen. So let's hit start on this. And there we go. It popped up the comic. Notice the comic actually expands, shrinks and grows with the window, which is kind of nice. The one thing I didn't do is add a border at the bottom. Let's go ahead and do that next time we close this out. But that's our application. We've called an API. We have gotten information back. We've used that information to load an image. Now a couple things. First of all, let's fix our image so that it has a margin. Let's just make it 20 all around. That gives it a little bit of padding. And now let's wire up these previous and next buttons. So let's start by actually giving them events. So if you just start typing click in your button and then drop down to new event handler, hit tab, it creates an event for me. I'll do the same thing for the next button. And now if we come over here, we have two new events, previous and next. So what we're going to do in the previous is say if current number is greater than 1. Because if the current number is 1, you can't go to position 0. It's a 1-based counting system. I'm assuming. Maybe I'm wrong. With that comic, it could be a 0-based. But I'm assuming it's a 1-based system. So let's say that 1 is the bottom one. So as long as you're greater than 1, you can go back 1. So if you're greater than 1, then current number minus equals 1, which subtracts 1 from the current number. And then we'll say the next image button dot is enabled equals true. Because what I want to do is I want to enable and disable these buttons depending on where we're at. Now, that kind of triggers my mind. Wait, this one's always enabled right now. Let's go ahead and disable it when we, right here in the constructor. So let's do the next image button dot is enabled equals false right away. So it immediately, you can't go further in the future because we're loading the current one. So the next image button will be enabled if you're going back 1. And then we'll do an await for load image. And we'll pass in the current number. Now the reason it's yelling is because this is not an async method. And we'll do the same thing down here for this method, this event method. So it's ready for it. And then we're going to say if the current number equals 1, meaning we're at the bottom now, then previous image button dot is enabled equals false. There we go. So that takes care of the previous button. Let's do the next button. If the current number is less than the max number. So that, remember that max number is whatever today's comic is, or this week's comic. So therefore, if the current number is less than that, we can go up 1. So current number plus equals 1. And we'll make sure we enable the previous image button. Because if you are going forward, you can go back. And then we will await the load image for the current number. And then if the current number equals the max number. So if we're at the top, then the next image button dot is enabled is false. So essentially, this is a mirror image of this, but in reverse. Okay, let's run that and make sure that it works. We haven't missed any logic here. So there's our current button, or our current, comic, and the next is grayed out, but the previous loads the previous comic. Notice next is now available. We can go back to that one. Now, this does bring up something that is kind of important to think through in your application. I have not put any kind of caching in here. So these comics don't change. Comic number 123 is always comic number 123. It's not going to be different tomorrow. So really what I could do here is I can have some kind of caching or minor database system behind the scenes that when I make a call to the API, it remembers that information for whatever period of time is relevant. So if it's time-sensitive information, well, then maybe we want to keep it for a shorter period of time. But in this case, I could keep it as long as I wanted to because the data is not changing. So therefore, the only thing that would change is the current one. Everything previous to that, if I have that number, I have the information, I don't have to go to the API to make that call. Caching information does two things for you. One, you become a good citizen because you're not going to continually bang against a web server, especially one you don't control. And so the other thing just want to caution you on is don't go flying through this and look at 80,000 comics all at once. Try and, don't just, next, previous. Try and take your time, read them even. That gives a little bit of time for the web server. You're not just overloading it with 1,000 calls a second. You also don't want that in your real world application either. So if you've got a for loop that's looping through and hitting that API with every single call, that might be an issue because you may have to have it then rate locked where it says, okay, you can only make 500 calls a minute or something like that. And some web applications do that. Or you may even cause a problem where they say, we just can't afford to keep this open in general. And now the application that you built that depends on that API, well, the API is no longer there. So just be a good citizen that way. And that's one of the ways that caching helps you. And the other way is that it makes your application faster. It should always be faster to go to the disk and get information off it compared to going to the internet to get information. So if you cache this information, then you don't have to go to the internet to ask for it. Now, I'm not saying cache the images necessarily. I'm not sure if that would violate their terms or not, but that would take up a lot more space. But what you could do is cache the information that tells you which image and which number it is. That's very easy to do, very quick, and it would save you some time. So just keep that in the back of your mind. I'm not doing any caching here, but I would recommend it. Okay, so there is our application for browsing the XKCD comic. Now, let's look at something that's slightly different, and that is the sun information, the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun. We want the sunrise time and the sunset time. Now that we know what we're doing, let's go ahead and create the model like we did the comic model. Let's create the model for our sunrise and sunset. Let's go over here and grab the sunrise and sunset times. And let's just run one of these and see the result we get back, which actually the response is right here. So notice this one's a little bit different. And this is one of the reasons why I want to show this one as well, is this actually has two properties, if you notice. One is results and one is status. Under results, it has properties. And that's where we actually want to get the information. The sunrise, sunset, and all the rest, which we're only worried about sunrise and sunset for this application. So it actually has two layers in. Well, how do you do that in your application? And it's actually quite simple. So let's create a new class. I'm going to call this class the sun result model. Make it public. And I'm not going to put any properties in here yet. I'm going to create another class. I'm going to call this the sun model. And naming this is hard, but we'll go with sun model. And in here, I'm going to create a date time property called sunrise, and a date time property called sunset. So those are the two things that I want from this API. I'm going to take the sun model though and come over here and create a property of type sun model called results. So the sun result model just has one property called results. It's of type sun model. And it seems like, why did you even create this? Because you don't really need it. Well, yes, you do. When we're going to map this JSON, let's bring this over here again. We're going to map this JSON. It's going to look for the matching properties. It only has two at the root level, results and status. And if it doesn't find a match for those, it's not going to do anything. But if it finds a results property, it's going to expect that to be an object type or class because the results, the value, is an object. And its object has sunrise and sunset. That's what we're targeting. So therefore, the object of will be the results property. So the results property, the object is sun model. That's the eventual goal for us. So that's how we set it up. Now let's go over and create a processor for it. So we'll call this the sun processor. Make it public. And this is going to be basically a copy and paste from this. In fact, I'm going to copy and paste it, which, yes, we can probably collapse this down. What I'd do if I was going to do this long term and have multiple of these is I'd make it generic and make these of type T and pass them in that way, and then pass in the URL as well. That way you could knock all this out into one generic method. But I'm not going to do that in this video. I'm just going to create essentially a copy of it and then modify it. Instead of comic model, it's going to be sun model. And yes, sun model, not sun result model. Because I don't really care about the result. That doesn't matter to me. That's just kind of fluff. What I care about is just the sunrise and sunset. So let's add in our using statements. And instead of comic model, we're going to get the sun result model. This is why I hate copy and paste. You have to modify a lot of stuff and not miss anything. Okay, so what I did there was I'm getting back a sun result model, which is not the model I want, but it has all the information I need. And then I'm just returning the results, which is that actual sun model. So now that should have my sunrise and sunset. The last thing to do is to get the URL, which I've actually created my own based upon my location. So there you go, that's my latitude and longitude, roughly. So now this will, when I not load comic, I want to load sun information. When I call this, I'll be able to get the information about the sunrise and sunset for today. Let's go over to our code behind let's go to the code for the sun. We have this load sun info. I'm going to call it right on the button for load. And I could call this on the window loaded method, or the event, but I'll just call it on a button click. And so the code behind now for this, we'll make this async. And now we can say, let's just do var. We could do the actual model name, but that's okay. Sun info. Be careful to step on the toes of the actual model. Equals sun processor dot load sun information. And now that we have that, we can say sunrise text dot text equals, let's do a message here. Let's close our thing there. Sunrise is at, and then it's our suninfo dot sunrise. Why is that not giving me back the, because I did not await it. If you don't await your asynchronous methods, that's a task, not the type you expected to return. There we go. Sunrise is at sunrise, but here's a trick. And if you read the website, it would tell you the times are in UTC. So we need to convert it to local time, which, cool enough, to local time. And I gotta do a to short time string. And that will give us a nicely formatted time for, in local time, for our sunrise. That'll be sunrise tomorrow. This will be the sunset text. This will be sunset. This will be sunset. And that's it. That should take care of loading the sun information. Now notice it's still using, I should have pointed this out already, but it's still using that same API client that MainWindow is. So they're sharing the same API client. Just kind of want to point that out. All right, last thing to do is to wire up in the MainWindow this button to actually load that other form. Here we go. Click equals new event handler. They go the code behind for this. And in here, we can say suninfo, and we can just call this suninfo equals new suninfo, suninfo dot show. That should be it. We run this. It's going to load the comic. Notice that the form load and the comic had not yet. It was a brief delay, but it was there. Sun information. Oh, I forgot one thing. And it was loaded on the other page is what I was doing. So we need to go over here to our sun info. There we go. And go here, go to properties, and change this to center screen. I should make this form bigger by default, but I didn't. Oh well. Sun information. Load sun info. Sunrise is at 6:06 a.m. Sunset is at 8:08 p.m. There you go. There's going to be sunrise and sunset times for today. And that's all there really is to calling an API from your C# application. It doesn't matter if your C# application is WPF, WinForms, console application, ASP.NET. The UI doesn't matter because the reality is we're not actually calling this in the UI. And that's something people often get confused. They're saying, well, how do I use this with this UI? It doesn't matter. I've got this in the demo library, which is a class library. Any of the full .NET Framework UIs can use this class library and make these API calls. Because coming out of this, there is nothing in here that deals with the web or anything of that. It kind of puts a filter on it and says, I'll deal with the stuff, dealing with actually calling the API and all the rest. What the UI deals with is it deals with objects. So it gets back an object, in this case, a sun model. Or in the case over here, it gets back a comic model. And that's the load image. So it gets comic model back. So that it shelters us, it shelters the UI from having to worry about, well, how do I do this? Doesn't care, doesn't matter. Our class library doesn't. And that's what I want to encourage you to think through, is the idea that your UI doesn't have to concern itself, shouldn't concern itself with a lot of these logic things, or in this case, data access. Because that's really what it is data access. Instead of accessing a database, we're accessing an API, which is from a database. So it's just one more layer, but it really is just database calls. And that's why this looks an awful lot like calling SQL. So if you've seen my SQL calls, they're all, Dapper wraps it, and Dapper gives me back just a model or a list of model. The same thing is happening here. I'm getting back a model or a list of model from the API call. Now, key things to remember: the API helper, which is where I have the HTTP client, we're opening that once per application. Now, if you want to do that, the base URL information, you can do that. And there are ways to set that up so you can have multiple base URLs per application. And typically, you're not calling 18 different APIs. So if you want to look into that, you can. That's kind of beyond the scope of this video. But I want to talk about that just briefly. The fact that if you want to change that base client, there's trickier ways of getting around that and doing that. Otherwise, your two options are to do what I did here, or to open up multiple HTTP clients. Preference is on not opening up multiple clients. The other thing I want to point out is I didn't deal at all with authentication. These APIs are open. You can call them directly. You don't have to authenticate. There's no rate limitations or other things like that. The reason I didn't deal with authentication, and it is a big topic, but the reason I didn't is because every API does authentication a bit different, it seems like. And whether you use tokens, whether you use a login and password every time, there's multiple different ways of doing that. And so to try and cover authentication is a much bigger thing to tackle because of the fact that I have to either cover a couple major ones and then leave 95% of all APIs out, or I'd have to cover a lot of different ones and we'd just be buried in, well, this one does it this way and this one does it that way. And so I decided not to cover that because the API itself, the documentation should tell you this is how it works. So for Twitter, it gives you a token. You have to set up the application. You have to set up the callbacks. And it's a little bit of a process. But when you do, you get a token. You can use that token then to make Twitter API calls. You just have to include that token with the calls. Well, that's a different setup than what even Facebook has or the other big APIs out there. So I didn't cover that, but I figured that each API should cover that in their documentation pretty thoroughly. My bigger concern was that you see, once you are able to talk to the API, how do you get data out and how do you use that data then in your application? The other thing I didn't cover in this video is I didn't cover posting information to an API. It's pretty similar, but there are some differences, and I will be covering that in a future video. I may even cover this in a start to finish series because dealing with APIs is something you're going to do on a somewhat regular basis, hopefully more regularly. One of the things I encourage is if you have data, make an API. That way, it doesn't matter if the API is only for you internally. At some point, you're going to want to expose that API. Someone's going to say, well, I want my computer to talk to your computer. How are you going to do that? If you have just a UI, you can't. So if you have even an ASP.NET MVC site, you can't really expose that data directly to another application. But if you have an API in between those two, then you have that flexibility in the future. So I recommend that pretty much if you have data, you write an API for it. So hopefully in the future, you'll deal with more APIs, but you're going to have to learn some of these things, based upon the API itself. Okay? So like I said, I'll cover this in a future video as well, some more in depth, but hopefully that gets you started in dealing with APIs in your application, using the information, consuming it, and really normalizing it, turning it into models that you just pass those models around like you've been doing for hopefully time with things like database access. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts on this, please leave them down in the comments below. I appreciate all the interaction we get on all these videos, and the more the merrier. And as always, I am Tim Corey.